I'm going to introduce today's speaker. And we're very, very happy to have with us today Dr. Lawrence Yang, who is a professor and chair of the Department of Social and Behavioral Sciences at NYU School of Global Public Health. And he's the founding director of the Global Mental Health and Stigma Program and associate director for the Global Center for Implementation Science at NYU. So I think you can see why we invited him here today to our rounds. Dr. Yang has over 180 peer-reviewed publications, including publications in journals like JAMA Psychiatry, and American Journal of Public Health, as well as an edited book called Migration Stigma. And he has received over 7 national awards, most recently the 2021 Maltz Prize for Innovative and Promising Schizophrenia Research from the Brain and Behavioral Research Foundation for his work. A lot of Dr. Yang's work is focused on 2 broad main areas: stigma, global mental health, and implementation science, as well as cognition of untreated psychosis, with a major focus of his work being on addressing stigma of health conditions, quite relevant, I believe, to his talk with us today. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Yang. As usual, we let our speaker speak without interruption, and then we will have sufficient time for Q&A and discussion at the end that Chris Ferraris will help me moderate. Okay, over to you, Dr. Yang. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Dr. Remian, a great pleasure. Thank you so much for the gracious introduction. So let me just bring up the slide deck. All right, Chris, you can see?
Yes, looks perfect.
Yes, all good.
Great. Just want to make sure I can advance it and we will get going. It's okay?
Yep, looks great.
All right, excellent. Thank you for the gracious introduction. Title of my talk today, Applying the What Matters Most approach to HIV stigma and extensions to intersectionality and global contexts. First of all, I just want to say what an honor it is actually to be asked to present at your grand rounds. I trained and started my earlier part of my career at Columbia. So I did my postdoctoral training. I was assistant to beginning associate professor, and I always looked over, honestly, to the HIV Center at Columbia in great admiration for the work that you all are doing. And so I was delighted to be asked to present, and I'm really excited, honestly, to present some of the work and present some new ideas to such a distinguished group. And I really look forward to an engaging discussion and feedback on some of these ideas. So my talk is broken up into 3 parts today. And so the first part, I'll just touch briefly around my research background. I will then move into the meat of my talk, which is this concept of what matters most. And I'll be talking a lot about what exactly that means and its application to HIV stigma in Botswana. And then the last part of my talk, I'm going to take a bit of a chance. I'm going to be talking about new directions in terms of how I believe this concept of what matters most could extend to intersectionality and to really deepen our understanding of how intersectional stigma works in marginalized groups. And like I said, this last part is going to be I'm going to take some chances, and I really look forward to getting feedback from you all. It's actually the first time I will have publicly presented these ideas. So just a little bit about me. As Dr. Remian mentioned, I have 2 buckets of large buckets of research. So global mental health and stigma of health conditions. And I'm not going to talk about global mental health at all today. I'm really just going to drill down on the stigma of health conditions. And this slide shows basically the evolution of my work in this area. So you could see here that I've actually started my work in stigma of mental illness, culture and mental illness, since my K Award 20 years ago. Hard for me to believe. I started in 2005. This work is extended through an R01. About 10 years ago, I was invited to start to apply some of these ideas to stigma of HIV, and in the context of Botswana, which I'll be talking about today. And this has been I was able to find support for this work through an R21 and another R01. Most recently, I've been able to extend this work further to the stigma of opioids and now cancer, and through some NIH supplements. So, I've had to be creative. I've had to be resourceful about, trying to try to get this work, continue this line of work, this line of thinking. The intellectual thread that runs through it all is this concept of what matters most, and I'll be talking about, this a lot today. So, what's the big issue? So, first of all, I feel like this almost doesn't need to be said to this crowd. However, just to start us off, so stigma, of course, is a big issue in many, many different conditions. It acts as a barrier to help seeking. It also exacerbates health conditions, and so including HIV. And my central thesis of today is that stigma also threatens the lived values that matter most in local communities, in local worlds. So again, I actually started off my career developing this concept and utilizing it among Chinese immigrants with psychosis in New York City during my K award. And honestly, the framework was actually developed specifically for this group. But then what I realized, afterwards, was that we had, developed such a deep way of thinking about this that I believed it could actually be applied to lots of groups, hypothetically any groups, locally or globally. So I was able to present on these ideas at the National Academy of Sciences in 2015. This was around mental illness specifically. To my great delight, after laying this work for the foundation of this work for about a decade, it was, discovered by researchers in HIV. And so I've been able to contribute to the HIV stigma literature, and was able to invited to participate on a workshop on intersectional stigma in 2020. And again, most recently, because cancer, NCI has understood that basically, the way that stigma occurs globally, it really impedes timely treatment. And so they found utility in this way of thinking as well. I want to take a minute or two to really pay intellectual tribute to really the originator of these ideas that I draw so heavily from. So this, if you don't know him, this is Arthur Kleinman. He is a renowned psychiatrist and medical anthropologist at Harvard. I got to work with him at the very beginning of my K award, and one of his prominent works is The Illness Narratives. This is basically required reading for medical students and other health professionals. But his work really addresses this concept of moral experience, of local worlds, and what is most at stake within local worlds, and how that relates to health and human suffering. I had the great pleasure just a couple of years ago. I had a chance to catch up with Arthur. We had dinner, and he's nearing the end of his illustrious career, and I just asked him. I said, what is it that you actually sort of looking at the span of your 40 years plus years of work, what are the things that you're most, proud of? And one of the things that he said to me, was actually the commitment to this idea. That despite funding priorities, funding would come and go, priorities would shift left or right, but it was really the commitment to this idea and to extending it throughout the trajectory of his entire career. And so I found that to be so inspiring, and I think that's one of the central messages of my talk today is really the in challenging times, really the moral and intellectual commitment to the work and to the ideas that can help to alleviate human suffering. So so I really want to, anyway, give great tribute to Arthur, who's helped to really set me along this path. So so this is the beginning of my story with Arthur. In 2005, I would meet with him, and he would give me these, no joke, hundreds of pages of ethnographies, essentially, around, Chinese social organization, basically how Chinese groups, interact with each other, and what is most meaningful to them in these local sort of forms of interaction. And so I would go home and I would dutifully read these books, and then I would take extensive notes. As you can see here, I actually photocopied all these books because, I wasn't making that much money at the time. So we would, and then I would, take extensive notes. You can see here, these, sort of artifacts have a special place in my office. I still, have them, and actually I pull them out every now and then, and I look at them to really, see, really return back to the insights that I gleaned from that time. Arthur also had me read seminal works from philosophers such as Pierre Bourdieu and Kant to really infuse the thinking with other, sort of a theoretical lens. So the fruits of this labor led to a paper in 2007 that I published with him and other distinguished stigma scholars. And we published this in Social Science and Medicine. And I'll just read it, and the title of the paper is, it's a Culture and Stigma. It was really trying to address a big gap in the literature at the time. And this is the key sentence. So mental illness stigma acts in culture-specific ways to impair an actor's capacity to take part in the core everyday engagements that certify one as a fully viable or fully moral member of a local community. All right, so let me, that's anthro speak. So let me say it in a more colloquial way. So each one of us, just as a human being, we engage in these, things that Arthur thinks of as local worlds. Okay, so basically it could be a community, it could be a workplace, a neighborhood. But what binds together these local worlds are the fact that they're participating, each member of the local world is participating in these everyday activities that signify personhood within the local setting. So, and within that, there is basically a set of values that signal to everybody in the local world that, oh, you're a respected part of this local world or local community. And so when stigma occurs, stigma affects everything. It affects everything about a person's experience. But our central thesis was that stigma most powerfully attacks what matters most or what is most valued in a local setting. So let me really and so this paper has had a substantial influence on the stigma field, and so it's been widely cited. And so let me concretize this idea and bring it to the setting that I'm going to be talking a lot about today in Botswana. So the proposal here is that stigma will coalesce most forcefully around a woman in Botswana's capacity to have and raise children, respect her husband, and be the foundation for her home. These are the capabilities that matter most, and are recognized as mattering most by both women and men within many local settings in Botswana. So I don't want to be Botswana is not monolithic, so there is a caveat, of course. Botswana is not monolithic. This doesn't apply equally to all women within Botswana, especially in the more urbanized, educated settings. However, it does apply, it appears to apply to many women. And I think that it's this correlative value that's felt very, very powerfully by many women within Botswana. So this is a way of depicting this concept, another heuristic to depict this concept. So here we have the individual, and then radiating out from the individual, the social function, social domain. So social function, family, life opportunities, work, and education. Stigma impacts all, again, the individual experience across all life domains. But again, so the thesis goes is that stigma coalesces around what matters most, again, in one's local community, the capabilities that determine personhood within a local community. And and what's powerful about the theory, I believe, is that what matters most is empirically discoverable. It's discoverable via qualitative methods and by interview. All right, so that sets the stage. Now let me bring you all into the work that we've done and are doing in Botswana. So Botswana is an extraordinary context to do work of stigma of HIV. So Botswana provides free and accessible HIV treatment to its citizens and has a tremendous public healthcare system. And because of this, availability of ART, at least until recent days, of course, that it's other factors that actually impede treatment use. So here, it's stigma is a huge factor that continues to contribute to non-adherence to HIV treatment. In Botswana, HIV prevalence is the third highest globally. It's around 20% of adults. So again, it's just an extraordinary context to really do this work. And again, I'm going to be presenting work on a completed R21, where we've done a pilot RCT, and then also a ongoing and funded R01. So let me talk a little bit about the healthcare policies. They play a very important part of the story. So in the 80s, like much of sub-Saharan Africa, Botswana was going through the HIV epidemic. And so at the time, there were a number of health policies that were put into place to improve population health. And this doubtless contributed to early identification and treatment of HIV within the Botswana context. But it's only after implementation of these policies have stakeholder attitudes about policy changes been assessed. I'd like to point out two very important healthcare policies that exist, one preceding the epidemic, one occurring afterwards. So Botswana is a relatively wealthy country. They have diamond mines. They've been a stable republic since their inception. And so they've been able to provide free antenatal care to their citizens since the early 1970s. Then after the HIV epidemic, subsequent to that, they were able to institute free national HIV treatment and in 2002. And as part of this, what happens is that anybody who enters into medical care, they are also subjected to routine HIV testing typically. Okay, they can sometimes opt out, but it's typically a routine part of just coming into the medical system. So again, these policies, generally beneficial, doubtless saved many, many, many lives. However, after the fact, can we take a look? It's also possible that these policies could also unintentionally reinforce a vulnerable position among certain disadvantaged groups. And so the central questions for this study this first study that we conducted was, how does culture, or what matters most, shape HIV stigma in Botswana? How does this intersect with these existing healthcare policies? So just a little bit about the methodology. We published this paper in the American Journal of Public Health in 2021. And so I'd invite you to take a look at the different details, but just to give you a sense of the methodology, we conducted a set of in-depth interviews and 5 focus groups. Because what matters most is lived by women in Gaborone, Botswana, and known by men. We interviewed both men and women, and those people living with and without HIV. We also we focused on perceived stigma, one certain aspect of stigma, which I'll get into in a little bit. We utilized a 2-step direct content analysis approach. We used both deductive and inductive methods. We had a multidisciplinary team who met extensively to analyze the data, and I'll be presenting to you codes again on what matters most, and this other concept of structural vulnerability. And I'll say just a bit about this. So structural vulnerability actually is similar. It draws from Paul Farmer's a concept of structural violence, but has a little bit of a different twist to it. So structural vulnerability is actually looking at a person's relative disadvantage due to marginalized statuses in relation to structures or laws or policies that exist. And so we use this framework in particular to look at the experience of women with HIV. All right, so I'm just going to jump right into it. And again, I'm going to really focus on some of the main ideas from this study. I would invite you again to take a look at the original study. So what matters most? With women, if you don't have children, you're not really a woman. All right, so this is basically as plainly stated as it could be. This is this is a quote from a woman with known HIV status. And there are lots and lots of other, sort of basically, quotes that essentially say the same thing, but from both men and women. So again, right, it's not according to, our framework, my framework, it's not just the fact that you have HIV that elicits stigma, right? It's the fact that how does having HIV intersect with what matters most that really shapes how stigma is experienced. So, and we found this to be the case. So perceived promiscuity in particular was found to violate this essence of womanhood, respected womanhood, to intensify HIV stigma. So let me read you the quote. We take it that a woman belongs into the home, so we wonder if she has HIV. There is no woman in her. She is careless, promiscuous. There is no woman. So this is, pretty extreme language, but this is actually the kind of thing that we're looking for to really, illustrate Arthur's, uh, concept around social death. It's as if, when this thing happens, the person ceases to exist socially. And so this is in essence what we're seeing, and it's tied to the promiscuity that's again tied to a woman, being the foundation for the family. So let me pause here for a second because there's another powerful and discovery and extension that we made to this theory. And so just bear with me just for 1 second. So what if a person could fulfill the capabilities that matter most within the local world? Let's say that they could do it, even if they had a stigmatizing condition. So in this case, what if a woman, right, was able to have and care for children, capably, and she had HIV? Would that enable her to fend off the worst parts of HIV stigma? And we found some evidence to support this. So again, and so we think of this as how what matters most could potentially protect against stigma. So I'll just read you the quote. I think the lady who is HIV positive, who's got kids, is much better off than a childless HIV negative woman because that person has dignity. So again, because this woman is able to achieve what is most valued in this local setting, she is able to fend off some or most of aspects of HIV stigma. Let me bring back the policies that I talked about earlier on in the very beginning. So, because they play a very important part of the story as well. So essentially, right, we've talked about how women, there's an overwhelming priority to have children. So usually women come into the healthcare system when they first become pregnant, early 20s, let's say, early to mid 20s. Men, on the other hand, never come into the healthcare system, just like sort of everywhere around the world, unless they are, acutely sick. And so what ends up happening because of this, because of what matters most among women, and again, the fact that free healthcare, antenatal care is established, and, routine HIV testing exists, what happens is that if the woman has HIV, she is identified first. And then that unleashes all the stigma. And because both genders are aware of this, men basically take advantage of this fact. So let me read you this quote. Men are reluctant to test, but women are required to do a routine HIV test during prenatal care. It's not like men are not sick. It's only that they don't go for testing since they rely on their women's status and assume it's the same as theirs. And so again, what's happening here is what I would, conceptualize as a structural vulnerability. The women are actually at a structural vulnerability because of these pre-existing healthcare policies and because of this dynamic that is set up, with what matters most. And so this is a way to depict this, through a figure. So again, women, it's again this incredibly dearly held value of having and raising a child. Again, we have these structural conditions, free antenatal care, routine HIV testing during pregnancy specifically. Women come in first to the healthcare setting, and then structural vulnerability is elicited because, again, the woman is identified with HIV first, and then the community, rightly or wrongly, perhaps wrongly in a lot of cases, believe that the woman brings HIV to the partnership. So the stigma then gets, sort of coalesces around the woman. All right. So let me, so we've also not just done this work qualitatively, we've brought it to the world of quantitative measurement. And so let me, I'll walk you through the two different subscales that we've actually developed and tested among women with HIV in this setting. So the first is around again, how cultural factors shape stigma. And so I'll just read you an exemplar item here. So most people in Botswana believe that a woman with HIV was promiscuous before marriage. So again, this item captures, right, the what matters most in these two statuses, the combination of these two statuses, womanhood and HIV. And then looks at the impacts of stigma by utilizing this theoretical lens. Very important for later in my talk, we are capturing intersectional stigma via at the item level via what matters most. Okay, so just please put that in your memory bank. For the second subscale, this is around the culture protects, or the cultural capabilities can protect. So an exemplar item here, most Botswana respect a woman with HIV who raises successful children. So again, if you can achieve what matters most, could that help you to fend off the worst parts of HIV stigma? And so this is actually published in 2020. And so we did a validation of these two subscales. And really where the action at, interestingly, is in the second subscale, which is actually, again, a unique, I believe, a distinct contribution to the HIV stigma literature. So if we just focus on these validation outcomes of social support and self-esteem, traditionally, if you think about a HIV stigma scale, right, it's greater stigma, you'll have lower social support, lower self-esteem. But the cultural capabilities protect scale is actually a positive stigma scale, stigma construct, and a positive stigma scale that could signal basically, ways of social integration within local communities. And so if the scale works, it ought to actually have a positive association with these constructs, these outcomes. And in fact, it does. And so we see modest and significant correlations between the cultural capabilities protect subscale with social support and self-esteem. So if I were to say this in plain English, if a woman believes that achieving what matters most can help ward off HIV stigma, that person has higher social support and higher self-esteem. So again, I believe that this provides we have a measure now to provide a quantitative roadmap for social integration. We have also brought this idea into intervention. And so we completed a pilot pragmatic trial, an R21, a couple of years ago. And so here, this is a what matters most stigma intervention among pregnant women with HIV. And so it is just a little bit about the intervention. It's clinician and peer co-led, 8 sessions. It revolves around 3 evidence-based practices for stigma reduction: psychoeducation, cognitive restructuring, and coping skills, all oriented towards what matters most. So again, focusing on the intersectional aspects of pregnancy, HIV, and womanhood, and is also future-oriented. So once women, achieve this respected status of motherhood, then this can launch women on to achieve other things within the community. So what we discovered from the women as well is in Botswana, there's this very powerful shawling ceremony that basically before a woman achieves motherhood for the first time, they actually receive these beautiful shawls that you see here. And so we actually wove this into the intervention. It's the last session that the women are given a shawl. And you could see here just the joy radiating out from the faces of these women, even though, I blurred it out here, but, it was an incredible moment. The intervention, started with women, despair from the stigma, often suicidal oftentimes as well, and really had changed things so much by the end. And in a nutshell, what we found from this intervention was we found from baseline, which is during pregnancy, to 4-month postpartum follow-up, we found decreased stigma and decreased depressive symptoms. And so again, I invite you to take a look at the publication if you're interested. I'm just going to show the numbers very, very briefly here, just so you have a sense of it. So we conducted the trial during COVID. Tough time. It was tough to, I'm glad that we pulled it off, but the numbers are, relatively small because it was conducted during that time. So the women in the intervention group, basically their depressive symptoms went down. So from the intervention, again, this is from baseline to 4-month postpartum. What gives us a little bit of confidence here that it wasn't just some natural effect that naturally occurring, right? That people just get better over time, was that the women in the control group, even though the numbers are pretty small, the depression and stigma goes up over the corresponding period of time. And so when you've got a difference in difference analysis, we see actually a pretty sizable effect size for both stigma change and depressive symptom change. And then we have also this very promising finding around, gestational age. And in a nutshell, women in the intervention group had longer gestational age for their baby than women in the control group. But we didn't want to make too much of it because this is certainly within the sort of the normal healthy range. All right. So this last slide, we are, trying to take this approach not just from the individual level, but to address the multi-level aspects of stigma. So what we did here, again, these are the 3 evidence-based practices that that I just described to you a second ago. So psychoeducation, cognitive restructuring, and coping skills. And we again orient these evidence-based practices towards what matters most, achieving what matters most at the individual level. We have also collaborated with our fantastic colleague, known to, I'm sure, all of you, Laura Nyblade, who has this marvelous intervention, the total facility approach. And so working with her, we did the same thing. We oriented her 4 aspects of her intervention. So HIV acquisition, addressing awareness of stigma, HIV attitudes, and the facility environment. And again, oriented these towards helping women to, fend off stigma and to achieve what matters most. And again, this intervention, very importantly, is done at the clinic level facility. And we just today, I got the notification that this pilot study was actually, accepted for publication. So really excited about that. Happy to send, the citation if any of you are interested. The aspiration, I mean, we'll see if we can pull this off. But the aspiration is to actually put the 2 approaches together, to actually create and test a multi-level intervention that counters stigma at both the individual and at the facility level simultaneously. So we're excited about, hopefully moving this forward. So let me just wrap up this section of my talk. What matters most is a multi-level perspective. And so here we can understand that stigmatized individuals, what I hope I've left you with, if nothing else, is this idea, right? That stigmatized individuals are seen as violating what signifies respective personhood in their local settings. And that I believe what matters most reveals cultural and structural ways to mitigate stigma. I also believe that it's useful and usable for multi-level stigma interventions. And then, as I'm going to get into in the second part of my talk, that it offers advances in measurement and intersectionality research. So this is the novel and sort of, more experimental part of my talk today. And so here we go. How what matters most can now extend into this area of intersectional stigma. So just a brief primer around intersectional stigma. And so again, probably speaking to a very knowledgeable group here. But number 1, stigma, this is stigma from more than one system of oppression on the basis of more than one stigmatized identity, attribute, or health condition. Seminal work by Michelle Berger, 2004. Also, it's intersectional stigma is understanding how multiple systems of oppression can lead to specific forms of marginalization, and how this confluence of oppressive structures then impedes life opportunities from the individual to structural levels. And this was written, by many people, but recently in the special issue AGPH, headed by Lisa Boleg in 2022. And so my central question for this part of the presentation is, can what matters most help to understand which statuses matter most, essentially, in this confluence of intersectional statuses, and which structural vulnerabilities as well are most salient in regards to people who are experiencing multiple forms of stigma. So I believe, so I'm going to present to you 3 arguments. A, that really honing in on which intersectional status could matter most locally in intersectional HIV stigma. B, how this then may apply to HIV intersectional stigma measurement. And then C, these and just initial thoughts around this, how what matters most could help us point to which structural vulnerability could be most impactful within healthcare. All right, so let me walk you through this slide, just orient you to this slide just a little bit, because there's a lot going on. Um, so we've done work now with three groups within Botswana who are distinct and share some important similarities. So, as I described to you earlier, women with HIV. So all the preceding part of my talk was all about this group. We also, and this is funded by these three separate awards. So we have also done work among a separate group of women with HIV and serious mental illness. So this comprises women with schizophrenia, bipolar, severe hospitalized depression, which I'm going to abbreviate moving forward as SMI. There's a third group as well, women with HIV and cervical cancer. So and then each group has, at the risk of oversimplification, but there's a core stereotype associated with each group. So again, for this first group, promiscuity, as I talked about. For the second group, it's really loss of control and competence. So women with serious mental illness are seen as just not being able to, function well in their everyday life. And then in this third group, because women with cervical cancer come into treatment so late in the trajectory of their illness, there's a strong perception of and actual infertility that occurs, as a consequence of the treatment of the chemotherapy, pretty invasive types of treatment that occurs at later stages of cancer. And then there's also connections with death. So what's really neat about this, we have about, in these two groups, we have about 15 to 20-ish qualitative interviews. And so what's been really nifty is that all of these samples, even though we've got three different intersectional statuses, all of these samples are located in Gaborone, Botswana. So they're all women from the same setting and all the data is collected within a reasonably, similar period of time. So we're able to see this potential confluences between how stigma is experienced, even though women have these different intersectional statuses. I want to credit Dr. Evan Eschliman, Dr. Ohemo Poku, who are at Columbia now, two wonderful mentees of mine who have really helped me to further this thinking. So let me bring you to this next slide. So here we've got the three groups that I described to you earlier. And the central thesis again here is that they're all women, right, within this local context. So I believe that what we're still will be felt again most powerfully, despite them having different intersectional statuses, is again this correlative value of having children and providing and caring for them. And we actually found this to be the case. So in this next slide, and I'll walk you through this. Essentially, this is core value of what matters most, again, shared in these local worlds. But then there's a variation, interestingly, tied to sort of these, this confluence of intersectional statuses. So for women with HIV, I read this to you earlier. If she has HIV, there's no woman in her. She is careless or promiscuous, there's no woman. So again, it's tied to this central core stereotype of promiscuity. For women with HIV and SMI, again, it's tied, it is, again, the same value of what matters most, but it's tied to this concept of loss of control or competence. So I'll read you the quote. If you're a mother, they take that you won't care for the child. You will relapse one day and won't be able to care, for the child. So again, it's tied to this correlative value, but it has this also is interwoven with it is this core stereotype. For women with HIV and cervical cancer, again, infertility being the core stereotype, a quote here, they treat you like an infertile person, that you are nothing unless of a woman. So again, it's tied to this, again, this correlative value, but it's, again, sort of, it has this flavor of it that is tied to these intersectional conditions. So in a nutshell, I believe that what matters most so the core issue is that or the contribution I believe is that these statuses are complex, and there are many ways in which they can intersect. what I believe this the What Matters Most framework can do is in certain circumstances really lend a coherence to understanding what status might be sort of most operative, for an individual in a certain condition in terms of how stigma is felt and experienced. Because we found this to be the case, we understand that, right, that each status will exert sort of stigma in each one of these ways. This then gives us a target, right, in terms of our interventions to really try to block or address stigma that impedes, again, what is most valued among women in the setting, depending on what set of intersectional statuses that they hold. Okay, so that's the first point. Okay, so I would sort of encapsulate this, A as, which intersectional status could matter most. All right. B is really around measurement, and how, again, the development of these scales has really contributed to the literature. So just again, a brief primer around intersectional stigma measures. There are really three ways to, the predominant ways of measuring intersectional HIV stigma. One is looking at measuring stigma attributes at the item level. So it's basically, again, capturing the confluence of a person's experience within the item itself. You'll note earlier in my talk that I pointed out that this is the very approach that we use, actually, by operationalizing what matters most within the item itself. The second way is to allow participants to ascribe stigma to attributes after the extent of stigma experience. So here, for instance, I'll just give you an example. It's easiest. So a woman with HIV, you could ask about stigma that's due to gender, and you ask about stigma that's due to HIV status, and then you look at the interactions of these things statistically. But essentially, you ask about stigma of each status on its own. And then the third approach, rather, controversial and, has a, not without its critics, but just for completeness, is the geometric approach by Kalikman. Very interesting thoughts around basically, it's like basically, utilizing the hypotenuse between two stigmatizing statuses to represent intersectional stigma. So it's very, very interesting idea, and is further in development. So, so the way that what matters most really contributes to intersectional HIV stigma measurement is, number one, there are very few validated measures of intersectional HIV stigma. That's just where our field is. And this then may be impeding intervention research in this area. And so I was actually, again, kind of like delighted and surprised, essentially, that there were two relatively recent reviews that identified that what matters most was the only validated process for measuring intersectional stigma at the item level. So again, it's like, how can I say? It's because I and we had been working in this area for a decade plus, and all of a sudden, we're able to bring this knowledge over to this new field that I believe, we've been able to sort of, make this impact in this relatively short period of time. All right, so this is the last part C, and this is the sort of the most risky and, sort of novel part, very sort of initial formulations on my part, but I'm gonna, test these ideas out with all of you. So this is the exact same slide as I showed you, in just a little bit ago, right? So we have the different intersectional statuses, we have the core stereotype associated, we have what matters most, and then the variations on what matters most. So I'm going to add to this. So this is the central question. If we can lay this out, or we can formulate this, can we then utilize this understanding, right, of what matters most, what's most valued, how it impacts women, how the stigma of these different statuses most impact women? Can we utilize this conceptualization then to trace out to the different structures that exist, right? And especially in the healthcare setting, that might most, impact women or make them most structurally vulnerable, and unable to achieve, again, what matters most, to them. So what I've done is I've added these blue boxes here, all right, and these indicate the healthcare structures or healthcare policies that exist that could basically that utilizing this conceptualization enables us to identify. So talked you through this one early in the earlier part of today's talk with women with HIV. So it could helps us to understand that it's this routine HIV testing that occurs in prenatal care, actually this structural vulnerability that then, makes women particularly susceptible to stigma and and impedes their ability to achieve what matters most. If I go down next to HIV and cervical cancer, and again here it's so what's really interesting here is in Botswana, there's been a huge push to actually screen women in a timely fashion, women with HIV in a timely fashion, and to detect cervical cancer. So that's done in a pretty timely way. But then for whatever reason, there's a gap for women actually receiving treatment. And so it's this gap or delay between the cervical cancer screening and the treatment that I believe is actually the structural difficulty or barrier that exists. That again, because women get into treatment so late, they then undergo chemotherapy. This then threatens infertility, and then it impacts this correlative value. So I believe if we're going to try to help preserve what matters most, that this would point us towards addressing this gap and delay. In an analogous fashion for women with HIV and SMI, again, it's this concept of competence, core concept of competence. The structural barrier or vulnerability here is there's a lack of centralization of psychiatric care. Excuse me, let me amend that. There's really a inordinate centralization of psychiatric care. There is psychiatric care is provided at one or perhaps two settings in the entire country. And there's a lack of integration between psychiatric and HIV treatment. So essentially, it's difficult for the women to manage and to balance both forms of treatment. It requires a lot of time, travel, resources, et cetera, et cetera. If women are less adherent to the psychiatric care, this can then predispose relapse. This then leads to this concept of, the stereotype of lack of competence, which then impedes, again, the ability to achieve what matters most. So again, just, sort of, this is more, again, exploratory right now, but I think that mapping it out in this way can help us, again, point to the aspects of the healthcare structures that we might want to act in, right? If we were going to try to alleviate, these impacts upon women and their ability to achieve what's most at stake for them. All right, so I've done a lot of talking. I brought you through a whole, set of ideas, and again, I know it's a lot to take in. So let me, bring things to a close. So again, there's nothing else that you take from today's talk, it's again that, stigma affects people everywhere, right? But we really see it as stigma most affects people in the ways that it's seen as how, in the ways that it violates personhood, right? Respect to personhood within local settings. And it's worth having that conversation, whether you're a clinician, researcher, or you just work in the community, to understand, what it is that is most valued within these local settings, because that can help us to understand how stigma is shaped and how we could potentially protect against stigma. What matters most, I also believe, offers advances in intersectionality and what is most valued locally. So again, which intersectional stigma could matter most in a certain circumstance, how we can measure these intersectional stigmas, and then what individuals are most structurally vulnerable to. And again, I believe that, we can utilize the theory to map out, again, what are the most pressing healthcare structures that may be impeding women's ability to achieve what's most meaningful. And then I just want to end by sort of where I began. And really, this is, my commitment to this concept. So I've been working with this concept now for 20 years. I'll just say, it hasn't always been easy to find funding for it. I've had to sort of be really flexible in the way that I think in sort of sort of disclosure, there are times that I actually had to, self-fund some of the work in order just to keep it going. And, but that's fine. That's the commitment that I take to the work. That's commitment that I think everybody on this call shares in terms of advancing the work and trying to really, find ways to benefit the communities that we serve. Um, and so, and so I'm hoping to, again, take this idea, continue to trace out its impacts on people's lives to understand and mitigate the experience of intersectional stigma. I'm in year 20, maybe I hope to make it to year 40, and, we'll see where this concept will continue to evolve. Oh, that's right. One last slide. Um, I also just want to, this is public now. So I am actually transitioning from my role at NYU School of Global Public Health, which I want to note, great institution. I have nothing but positive things to say about the school, the leadership. I've had, a dynamic time there. I am transitioning to the Duke School of Nursing on August 1 of this year, and I get to return to my research, and I'm proposing the development of a new center, the Multi-Level Intersectional Stigma and Health Outcomes Network, in brief, the Mission Network. And so this work, I really hope to push forward and, see develop the next chapter of in this next professional transition in my life. So thank you so much for your attention today. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to hearing all your thoughts and comments. And thanks again.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yang. That was very interesting, very rich. I hope there's some good discussion now.